The Beyonder is back, ladies and gentlemen, and that's not even the main thing that happens in this story. This story's crazy, or at least this issue's crazy, right? So here's what this does. This initially opens up with the Avengers facing off against a guy named the Autocrat. He doesn't matter, he's ultimately defeated by She-Hulk, whatever, who cares? The thing about this is this story takes place immediately after the events of All Out Avengers. We didn't cover the entirety of that because there were only select moments in that story that were important. We'll talk more about that later on when we get to the main villain that's being introduced here, who's basically the new god of Marvel Comics. It's crazy. But what ends up happening is that once the Autocrat is overtaken, the Avengers are brought by Iron Man and T'Challa to a new room that they've never seen before in Avengers Tower. And the thing about this is that even when the Avengers say, like, we've never been in this room before, the response of Iron Man and Black Panther is, neither have we. Now, if you guys notice, there's like this kind of monologue that's being offered, right? These blue squares with white letters. That is the Beyonder talking. We know that from All Out Avengers. We know the Beyonder's back. We've known that for a while. But the thing about this is he's always kind of talking about how there's a main event that's taking place, something that's transpiring, and what he's been doing or had been doing during the events of All Out Avengers is altering reality around the Avengers themselves to create these weird and wonky circumstances in the hopes of changing their perception of the world and kind of bringing their mind to newer heights so they can face off against greater threats than they've ever encountered before. One of the things to remember is that at the end of All Out Avengers, Captain America figured out the Beyonder was the one who had been manipulating reality around them, right? There was literally this moment where he was standing in a room by himself and directly addresses the Beyonder because he was seemingly the only one who had ever done anything like this before from Secret Wars 1 and Secret Wars 2. So the MO made perfect sense. And so what had happened here is Black Panther and Iron Man had basically worked on this system that would be able to detect an energy source and then force that energy source to enter into its physical form. The problem here is that any time the Avengers came close in the All Out Avengers storyline to figuring out that Beyonder was the one behind all this, he would alter reality around them again. So they would basically lose whatever momentum they'd gained. And so by working separately, as far as the Beyonder was concerned, they were just kind of doing individual things and working on individual projects, and he was none the wiser. Secretly, they were working on two halves of the same machine, and they basically pressed a button when they were completed, and the machine teleported to this current location and effectively assembled itself. And then once the Beyonder realizes what's going on, it's too late. The machine's turned on, and the Beyonder is yanked out and pulled into a physical form. Now, here's the thing about this, right? For those of you guys who are not familiar with the Beyonder, this guy is as close as you get to God as anybody ever has been in the history of Marvel Comics. There's two versions of Beyonder, right? You have what's called pre-retcon Beyonder and the modern day Beyonder. Pre-retcon is the level of power he had in Secret Wars 1 and Secret Wars 2 before you get to the unofficial Secret Wars 3. You'll find a link to that playlist down in the comments section so you can basically see exactly what I'm talking about and understand the change that Marvel made when they reduced his power. But one of the things that Jonathan Hickman had done in Avengers and New Avengers is he had returned both the Beyonder and the Beyonders, his whole race, back to the level of power they had at the beginning of all things, which is why you saw the Beyonders wiping out the cosmic entities at the end of Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers run. Literally, it was a massacre. Hank Pym's just like out in space trying to find out where the incursions, like how it's all starting, and he sees the Beyonders killing like Eternity, Infinity, Oblivion, Master Order, Lord Chaos. They kill the Living Tribunal. It's nuts. It's one of the most insane moments ever in the history of the comic. Oh God, I love that point in Marvel Comics. But the thing about this is that once the Beyonder re-emerges, he immediately panics and starts to freak out because what he says is, you have no idea what you've done. I've been trying to help you. I've been trying to help you by putting you through the paces, through all these crazy escapades and whatnot, giving you different levels of power or different tools that you can use because you have no clue what's coming. There's a reason I've been hiding, and I'm hiding from that guy. That's something to understand here. The Beyonder, this being of astronomical power, is hiding from someone because they're so much more powerful than he is that he can't even begin to compare. And that's when he starts to spill the beans on what's going on, right? He says, before the Omniverse came into being, there was the Lost One. The Lost One created the Beyonders, much like they would later do with me. He imbued my people with the tiniest fraction of his power. He watched watched with interest as my people grew jealous and then resentful, and he watched as they plotted against him. When they attacked, he allowed it, curious to see what would happen. This turned out to be a mistake, realizing too late the genuine threat they posed. The Lost One could do little as they stole the rest of his power. Now, there is something that I do want to talk about here for a second, and that's Defenders Beyond by Al Ewing. And the reason for this is because this story is not written by Al Ewing. This is written by Derek Landy. And the reason why that's so important is because in Al Ewing's Defenders Beyond, what he stated is that the Beyonders were actually created by the Celestials. So we've got an inconsistency here. Now, what we don't know, and this is one of the things you just kind of have to wait and see in Marvel Comics, is which one Marvel goes with. This summer, actually I think it's in the fall, one of the big things that's taking place this year is that Jonathan Hickman is coming back to Marvel Comics to basically write a story about Marvel's gods. What in effect it seems like he's going to do is completely rework and restructure the nature of the cosmic hierarchy in Marvel Comics. So we'll have a definitive understanding of where people rank in terms of the level of power they have, who's in continuity, who's out of continuity, that kind of thing. So all you can really do right now, if you are reading Marvel Comics, is just kind of take this as potentially one possibility of where the Beyonders actually came from, that neither answer seems to be definitively right. But what is important here, assuming that we take this as an absolute truth, is the Beyonders are not native to their own source of power. And this flies in the face of everything we know about the Beyonders, right? So a little bit of explanation here for those of you guys who aren't familiar with the nature of the Beyonders, their power, different things like that. When the Beyonder was first introduced in Marvel Comics, he was just kind of a one-off in the Secret Wars story, and that was it. But Secret Wars proved to be so popular, they brought him back. And then that was all we really got, right? It was like the Beyonder Secret Wars Part 2, and that was it. It wasn't until you got to the Fantastic Four story that was kind of the unofficial Secret Wars 3 that you learned the Beyonder is simply one member of a race called the Beyonders, and they exist beyond all space and time, outside of the multiverse. Now, that was kind of the standard going forward for years. There wasn't really any indication or reconciliation between the Beyonder and the Beyonders outside of the fact that the Beyonder was part of their race and for whatever reason was interested in the multiverse in Marvel Comics. When Jonathan Hickman came along in Avengers and New Avengers, what he basically said is the original Beyonder from Secret Wars, the one you see here right now, this one was like a child, right? A baby more or less, that had kind of been created inadvertently when the Molecule Man Owen Reese had basically conducted his experiment and created a cosmic cube by accident. And in doing so, half the energy went into Owen Reese, the other half went out and became the Beyonder. The Beyonder's source of power was never really explained. It was always just a level of power that they had that made them incredibly powerful. Al Ewing in Defenders Beyond explained that by saying their level of power was given to them by the Celestials so that if another war broke out between the Celestials, the Beyonders could put the kibosh on it, right? And just end the threat like that so it wouldn't lead to the destruction of the multiverse again. And so it's just kind of been that way ever since. This is a whole new explanation, right? The fact that there is a singular being out there who had such an astronomical level of power that the Beyonders stole that power from him and then dispersed it among themselves and used it for their own ends. Now, the funny thing about this is that as is explained here, the Lost One cannot be traditionally killed or destroyed in seemingly any conceivable way. We're not told why. We're simply just told that's the case. And so they basically imprisoned him on a moon that existed outside the Omniverse. Now, one of the things that I want to explain here is that in Marvel, in more recent years, Omniverse and Multiverse are just two words to describe the same thing. It didn't used to be that way. The Omniverse used to be a collection of multiverses, and in fact, the Omniverse was kind of the unofficial comic book explanation for the collection of the DC Comics multiverse and the Spawn multiverse and the Marvel multiverse and any other multiverse that exists out there as a giant collection of multiverses. But again, in this day and age, Marvel seems to be using multiverse and omniverse as interchangeable terms. But of course, with him being imprisoned, what ended up happening here is somewhere along the line, he basically broke out, and that what he's been doing is traveling around the multiverse, killing any Beyonder he finds, absorbing their power into himself, or any force that the Beyonders send after him in order to try to destroy him. But the bigger point the Beyonder makes is that he and his race are just fleeing for their lives and hiding away from this guy as best as they possibly can. So what we thought was at one point these astronomically powerful gods are hiding from someone even more powerful. What I'm hoping you're noticing here particularly if you're reading Marvel as a whole and have been for the last couple years, the entire hierarchy is being thrown in disarray. A good example, the one above all is no longer the most powerful being in Marvel Comics anymore. We know that from Defenders Beyond, right? The Crown, or whatever it is that he's called, the Enigma, is the most powerful being out there in Marvel right now. But the funny thing about this is that when the Avengers ask, so why are you here? The response to the Beyonder is, so you can help me fight this war. And the Avengers are kind of like, what are you even talking about, man? Like, so you're literally telling us that there is a guy out there whose level of power dwarfs the power of you, and you were a guy who popped up on the scene and like killed death in our universe, and the cosmic entities had no choice but to go to the Molecule Man Owen Reese and ask him for help because they were helpless to stop you, right? That took place in Secret Wars 2. Like, you're that guy, and you think we can help you defeat this other dude? What are you talking about, man? Like, I mean, if we can find a peaceful resolution, sure, I guess, but like, we can't win a war against a force like that. Like, what could we do? Harsh language? You get the Infinity Gauntlet, cross our fingers, and hope for the best? Like, I mean, there's nothing we can do here. And the response to the Beyonder is simply, I've given you whatever tools you need to succeed. But in the midst of all this, where he initially allies himself with the Avengers and says, I will help you fight this war, and presumably I'll gather the other Beyonders and we will try to do the same, they're suddenly met by the arrival of Tiamat. Now here's the thing, Tiamat was introduced in All Out Avengers issue number 4, but the reason why I didn't cover it at the time is because it didn't seem to serve a real purpose. The only thing that happened is like Tiamat showed up and beat the crap out of Carol Danvers, which was kind of amazing to see, but all we saw with her was that like at the end of the comic, she had approached just this crazy, wild looking dude who of course we now know to be the Lost One, and like that was it. There was no context to the situation, so it just didn't really make any sense to cover it at the time. But the idea behind this is that Tiamat is basically an emissary of the Lost One. As it was explained in Avengers Beyond number 4, she's like his right hand, right? So like his top person that he basically sends out. But the funny thing about this is that Thor stands to her alongside Carol Danvers, and this girl crushes them both. This is what's so wild about this, right? Under any normal circumstance, a villain showing up and facing off against the Avengers, I mean, it's cool, and you get to see like a bit of a battle. This girl, it's not even really a battle so much as child's play, right? It's her just kind of keeping herself entertained at the moment. This chick isn't even really trying, but she's single-handedly crushing the entirety of the Avengers by herself. But ultimately, she ends up achieving her goal. And this happens when she pulls a dagger and is able to cut the Beyonder. And when that happens, as he bleeds, she says, it's done. That because of her actions here, that basically injuring him, his blood has now spilt in the physical realm, which means now, she literally says, if you use your powers in any way, right, if you leave this planet's atmosphere, he will know. He will know exactly where you're at. So the best thing you can do here is to stay and hide. Now, this may seem arbitrary. It may seem like Derek Landy is kind of pulling this out of nowhere. This is actually not true. He's borrowing a page out of the old Silver Surfer comics from back in the day. And anybody who's familiar with Marvel Comics would tell you that. So for those of you guys who don't know, in the original Galactus trilogy in the Fantastic Four, when Galactus first popped up, at the end of the story, the Silver Surfer actually turned against him. And so what it did is it forced Galactus, or at least drove Galactus, to imprison the Silver Surfer on Earth. And what it did is that kicked off the Silver Surfer solo series, where he was basically traveling around the world, working alongside different superheroes, learning about humanity, different things like that. It was a resoundingly successful, and even to this day, still holds up as a phenomenal comic book. It's amazing. But this is where Derek Landy's getting this from, right? Quite literally, Beyonder is made a prisoner of Earth. More so than that, and kind of what feeds into the plot, he can't necessarily use his powers, right? He can't say, okay, well then I'll snap my fingers and I'll help you guys defeat this guy and we'll call together all the different ones, so on and so forth. Instead, he has to go back to his incorporeal form and just kind of remain in hiding at different places on Earth. And that's it, because the instant he leaves, that's all there is to it. Now, where Tiamat is locked up by the Avengers and basically put inside of a prison that'll basically hold her, the main concern the Avengers have now is what's going to happen if this guy sends more forces after us. And that's exactly what he's doing. Specifically, the Lost One is sending a reformed and presumably cosmically amplified version of the Cull Obsidian. Supergiant, Black Dwarf, the Ebony Maw, Corvus Glaive, these guys are all coming after him. So it's gonna be kind of amazing. Now what this does is this picks up with the Avengers fighting the Black Order. And for the most part, everybody here is recognizable to you if for no other reason than Infinity War. The only exception would be Black Swan. And unless you've read Marvel Comics, you don't know who she is. Black Swan's part of the Black Order. She has been for quite some time. She's basically Valeria Richards, the daughter of Reed Richards from an alternate reality. She's really powerful. But under normal circumstances, I wouldn't care about the Avengers fighting the Black Order. I'm telling you about this so you understand what happens next, because the Avengers are about to get wrecked. And not even by a little bit, right? Not even by a little bit. So the funny thing about the Black Order is they're easily an Avengers level threat, right? They go toe to toe with these guys, and it really is just a knockdown, drag out fight. And for the most part, the Avengers are able to hold their own. Now, one of the things to understand that's been going on here, and this is something that we talked about in the last video, all of this is based around the concept of the Lost One in Marvel Comics, which is to say a newly introduced being who's responsible for the Beyonders getting their power. He's this guy that's just astronomically powerful. I mean, being able to alter reality on like a multiversal scale. The Beyonders rebelled against him, stole his power, and then locked him away. He ultimately escaped, and he's been traveling through the universe and even the multiverse trying to find the Beyonders and kill them everywhere he can. The Black Order being here is a result of them being summoned and kind of brought in by the Lost One himself. But the kicker behind all this is there's a great big huge kind of barrier that surrounds the Earth that was really created with the assistance of the Beyonder to keep the Lost One out. It's not going to work, because while the Avengers were able to overcome the Black Order at the end of the day, Captain America calls out to the Beyonder, because remember, the Beyonder originally appeared, warned the Avengers of the Lost One, and then took off. But Captain America knows the Beyonder can hear him because the Beyonder's kind of watching everything that's going on, even if you can't physically see him. But the thing about this is the shield suddenly goes down, and then the Lost One shows up. Now, leaving out the fact that this guy looks like Super Shredder, this dude is a hoss. An absolute hoss. Here's the funny thing about this, man, it's like this amazing moment, because as the Avengers are standing there, right, Captain America, Captain Righteous is like, you're not taking one step further. This dude doesn't say a word and takes one step further. Iron Man blasts him with his energy blast. All the Avengers jump in. This guy's like, man, son, you better come strong. This guy punches Thor, sends him flying, levels Captain Marvel in one shot, takes out Captain America in one hit, just like knocks this guy to the ground. Thor jumps back in with another hit, gets blasted into the ceiling, done. Like, it's one of those crazy moments. It's amazing to see this happen. So what this guy does is he basically walks up to what are 4 crystals, takes them, and then basically proceeds to leave. Now, the Avengers try to rally themselves and try to go back in on the assault, only for them to realize the shield's back up again. And that's when it dawns on Captain America. When the Beyonders showed up here and the Beyonders said, I will help you guys basically build a shield that will keep out the Lost One. You can marshal your forces, you can bring together whatever powers you need to in order to defeat this guy. I mean, good luck, right? Because as the Beyonders, we killed all the cosmic entities, including the Living Tribunal. This guy's more powerful than us. So, hey man, I don't know what to tell you. Right? Like, what he realizes is when the shield goes back up, it was never about the Beyonder helping them. It was about the Beyonder setting a trap. It was the Beyonder lowering the shield so the Lost One would come in, collect the 4 crystals, and then in turn, the shield would go back up and keep him trapped on Earth with nowhere to go. And so following this, the Beyonder alters reality within Earth and then creates like a whole nother set of Avengers, which initially fight against the main Avengers themselves. It's a little funny, it's kind of interesting, it's not overly significant, but then the group basically turns its sights on the Lost One. And of course, once the fight breaks out again, they all get crushed again, right? You think they would have learned their lesson the first time, but then like the Beyonder himself shows up, and initially he goes to challenge the Lost One, right? He says like, greetings, my fearsome friend, I am Yonder, the bootleg Beyonder. What manner of being might you be, right? Because it's like the bootleg Avengers. This guy just snatches them up, right? And it's just like, no, we're not doing this, right? This game's over. And once the fight's back on again, of course, the Avengers taken out quite readily. I mean, they're demolished. And so the funny thing here is that this guy takes off his helmet. He realizes the main Beyonder himself is still out there. The bootleg Beyonder was just like a facsimile. And this guy flies out to the very edge of the barrier. He can't pass it, but he flies out to the very edge of the barrier and then starts talking to the Beyonder and just says like, you have my power, I want it back. Now, one thing to remember here is that once the Lost One was on the move, what the Beyonder told us is that all the other Beyonders across existence were just fleeing for their lives. That's literally the best they could do. That was the best they could hope for, was to just run and hope they didn't get caught. Because the instant this guy got a portion of his power back, it was more than enough to take out any one particular Beyonder. And so tracking them down individually, they never had a chance. The funny thing here is the entirety of this barrier and the entire basis behind how it exists comes by way of all the Beyonders appearing. Now, a little bit of explanation here. We probably should have done this earlier. For those of you guys who are unfamiliar with the Beyonders, again, they're ridiculously overpowered. They come from the Beyondverse. There are different variations of their origin in Marvel Comics. You can just kind of go with whatever origin you want to. But again, like we mentioned earlier, in Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, they killed all the cosmic entities. One Beyonder in a single universe was powerful enough to wipe out every cosmic entity. Galactus, the Celestials, Eternity, Infinity, the whole 9 yards. 3 Beyonders were powerful enough to destroy the living tribunal, the living embodiment of the multiverse, and what's supposed to be the second most powerful being in existence after the one above all. In this moment here, we've got 4. Not only that, the Lost One's more powerful than them. Just to give you guys perspective here. Now, the nature behind the crystals is that they are, in fact, Beyonders themselves. And that's what the main Beyonder did, is he basically used the crystals or used Beyonders, condensed them down to an almost crystalline form, and then basically have them operating as a kind of source of power for the nature of the shield, imprisoning the Lost One using the power of the Beyonders themselves. Now, where the other Beyonders show up here and they really kind of chastise him for his actions, the response of the Lost One is like, I'm going to kill every single one of you. You are all going to die. And he can do it too. Well, at least if you never get past the shield. And in fact, what the Beyonders say is exactly that. Your shield is imperfect, Beyonder. It's only a matter of time before someone with enough power manages to break through it. This guy might not necessarily be able to do it, but somebody will. And when that happens, all hell's gonna break loose, right? It's gonna be an absolute calamity. And so following that, they basically tell him, what you've done here until such a time as someone's able to break through this shield, you've effectively saved our people from complete and total annihilation. But we cannot ignore the fact that you have attacked one of your own, or at least your own people themselves. You attack them, you confine them to a state of living death, and they will stay here on Earth forever, operating as a source of power for a barrier to try to keep this guy trapped. So you, Beyonder, are banished from your kind. You are no longer welcome to us as the Beyonders. They strip him of his power, literally take away every ounce of power that this guy has. They say you will be confined back to a human form and you will be sent back to Earth. They cast him down. So this guy goes crashing down to the surface and the Beyonder is now human. Now, of course, the question has to be asked, what in the world happens next? This video will explain that, but we do a bit of a time skip between the end of the last video that we did and the start of this one. And what's basically happened is the Lost One has effectively wiped out most of the superheroes on Earth, or at least defeated them, and really even killed a whole bunch of them. And in fact, one of the big things that you guys kind of asked was that if this guy is so powerful, why doesn't he just like do what some kind of crazy reality warper would do and just alter all things in existence or something along those lines? Well, the way this is answered, and I'm curious to see how you feel about it, is we're basically just told power has limits, right? This body I wear, though I fashioned it myself, is still only as capable as that for which it was designed. When I first conjured it eons ago from matter and energy, it was, for all intents and purposes, perfect. I could swim on the surface of a sun, I could fly through a black hole, I could shatter a moon with my fist. And then my power was stolen from me by beings that are called the Beyonders, and that he's basically been trapped in this body ever since. The bigger point that's being made here is that those individuals who can alter reality or who have insane levels of power are largely limited by the bodies in which they occupy, which actually makes sense. And in fact, that's been a case in Marvel Comics for quite some time. It wasn't really overtly stated the way that it's being stated right now, but it was one of those things that you just kind of came to understand, right? Franklin Richards could do all kinds of fantastic stuff, alter reality on a universal scale. Mad Jim Jaspers could do the same thing. Matthew Malloy could do it to a degree, but he resurrected himself from the dead, and we never really got the full totality of what he was capable of. But any one of these guys, if they were without a body, would be able to achieve ridiculous things in Marvel Comics. Hence the nature of M-bodies when it comes to the cosmic entities. entities. If you don't know what that is, we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But the thing about this is that what we saw at the end of the last video is that as part of a kind of quote unquote punishment, which is to say, when the Beyonders had initially stolen the power of the Lost One for themselves, and they in turn started perusing the cosmos, that what the main Beyonder had done in order to keep the Lost One trapped on Earth is he had kidnapped other Beyonders and then basically used them as a kind of prison system, siphoning off their energy and so on. But in effect, he turned against his own kind. The result was that his power was stripped away from him by the other remaining Beyonders, and then he was cast down to Earth. And that's why here in this moment, when he's approached by the Lost One, he talks about how he doesn't remember anything, he doesn't have his powers, he doesn't know how the shield works or any of that stuff, because he doesn't, right? Like all that stuff was taken away from him. The idea behind the main Beyonders themselves is that they would basically have the Lost One trapped here on Earth, and that would effectively be it. And so what we end up doing is picking up in the ruins of what used to be the city of New York. Again, we never really saw how New York fell. We just kind of jumped forward to after it was basically destroyed and She-Hulk was tattered and so on and so forth. The big thing here though is that what they had discovered is that before the Beyonder had encountered the Lost One in this story, what he had done was taken a portion of his memory and put it within New York City itself underground, so that if something were to happen, he could basically attain this portion of his own memory and then figure out exactly what needs to be done to set things back to rights. Exactly why he did it, I'm not entirely sure, and it looks like it's being done just for the sake of being able to tell the story. But of course, the Avengers kind of ask him, what do you know about the Lost One? He of course reveals the Lost One's name as being Kalhora, which we already know, and that the question is there a way to lower the shield to get this guy off of our planet? Now, what Iron Man also does is he fashions a device to this orb that the Beyonder's memory is currently sitting in. And when the Lost One shows up, he deduces that the nature of this item, this artifact, is that it will basically blow the orb up and destroy the memory of the Beyonder should the Lost One choose to use his powers. And so what you get is this really interesting quagmire here, this really interesting situation. The Lost One's been around for countless eons, right? At the end of the day, the Avengers are just like superheroes on Earth who do superhero things because that's what superheroes do. But depending on where you stand in the philosophy and morality of superheroes, you could see their goodness as a weakness. And that's how the Lost One sees it, right? His stance when She-Hulk kind of freaks out, when he says like, are we here to banter or are we here to fight? She makes this statement in saying, you killed thousands of innocent people. And his response is, actually, it was tens of thousands. If you're going to talk about what it was that I did, at least get it right? I mean, I killed tens of thousands of people, not just like thousands of people. And where Thor responds in saying, we do not negotiate with murderers, the response of the Lost One is, but of course you do. To save yourselves and your planet, you do it all the time. Is what I ask unreasonable or just merely distasteful? What makes this situation different than any of the countless others where you've made bargains with villains, where you've done all kinds of things to work alongside villains in order to make sure that your schemes came to fruition? A really good example of this is during like the incursions, the collapse of the multiverse. Once you got to that situation and everything was popping off, there was no differentiation between hero and villain. It was just people who were trying to survive. During the events of Civil War, right, you had the superhero community that was split down the middle. There were no heroes or villains there. It was simply people who were against registration and for registration. So there's been multiple instances over the case of Marvel Comics where heroes in the traditional sense are willing to cast aside their own morality for the sake of a greater cause. And that's the point that he makes. He says, you value your principles and your honor, but these are words and concepts and intangible things. With the luxury of choice, they are indeed to be protected. But people, there's no choice when it comes to protecting people. That is what heroes do. So when you have to choose between giving me the knowledge I seek, i.e. how to lower the shield, thus betraying your principles, or watching as I slaughter your mortal population, you will grit your teeth and give me what I want. And that's the accurate statement. That's really exactly what would happen here. That the idea of the Avengers standing with their arms on their hips in this Superman pose and saying, we're good guys and we do good things and no way we're gonna give ground to a villain. It's standing on ceremony, right? It's political grandstanding and really nothing more. Now, the cool thing about this is that in response to that, Captain America suddenly shows up kind of longing for a fight. It doesn't amount to much, but he does come with a bit of a caveat. And this is where we explain the nature of like the Celestials and all this kind of different stuff, right? So for those of you guys who don't really know what M-bodies are in Marvel Comics, when it comes to cosmic entities, Eternity, Infinity, any number of these guys, with the exception of Galactus, if we're being honest, they have no physical form, right? Like they just kind of represent ideas. When a cosmic entity wants to appear with a physical form, it travels to a place called the Dimension of Manifestations, which is home to a being called Anthropomorpho. This was explained in the old Quasar comics back in the early 1990s, back when Greg Capullo was drawing at Marvel, for those of you guys who read the Batman run and didn't know that. But when this happens, of course, they get a physical form, then they appear, and that's basically it. With regards to the Celestials and how they function in all of this, the idea behind this is that in recent years in Marvel, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with this, the Beyonders were just like beings who existed out there beyond the multiverse. And that's all we ever really got. What ended up happening during Al Ewing's really Defenders Beyond and even the main Defenders story is we learned that the Beyonders were created by the Celestials due to the Celestial Holy War that happened at the very beginnings of all creation. And the idea was that if for some reason the Celestials in any one particular universe went to war against themselves again, the Beyonders would be able to step in with this astronomical amount of power that they have, and they would stop the fight between the Celestials, potentially even wiping out the entire universe. So they were created as a kind of checks and balance. That's why when Captain America shows up here, he's drenched in celestial blood, because what the statement is that's made here is it's simply that the Beyonders and even the Lost One got his power from the Celestials, but there was a caveat built into it, which is that they cannot actually harm Celestials unless the Celestials are waging war against each other. So kind of like a magical binding or a power-based binding or something along those lines. Is this being done as like a giant plot device for the story? Absolutely. It 100% is being done that way. Right? But it does tie in very neatly to what it is. Well, maybe not neatly, but it does tie in to what Al Ewing has been covering with Defenders Beyond, or at least what he did cover with that story. Now, transitioning over to the main Beyonder himself, once he approaches his memory, his idea is to basically work directly with the memory, absorb it into himself, and then in turn, he'll recall everything that the Lost One needs to know. It will not be a return to his powers, but it will give him the information that he needs. Now, such as it is, when it comes to the Lost One fighting Captain America with all this celestial blood on his body, it really kind of just comes down to a hand-to-hand fight. He does use things like optic blasts and so on and so forth, or shooting lasers out of his eyes, or whatever you want to call it, but it's not really using like the vast power that's at his disposal. And so the result of this is that the fight happens kind of the way that you would expect it to, right? Just a good old-fashioned knockdown, drag-out fight. But in the midst of all this, the Beyonder steps up and then stops the whole thing and says, I will tell you exactly what it is that you want to know, but you have to agree to give me back my power. I want to become one with the cosmos again. And ultimately, the Lost One agrees, right? That what ends up happening is the Lost One scans the mind of the Beyonder, learns how to effectively shut down the shield, and then absorbs all the power of the three Beyonders who are serving as a battery for the shield into himself. He's not as powerful as he used to be, but he's a lot more powerful than he was at the beginning of this story. And so when the Beyonder says, return my power to me, the Lost One says, okay, and then literally just kind of disintegrates him, right? Dissipates him to where he goes back to becoming one with the cosmos. He just doesn't really have a physical form anymore. He could reconstitute it at some point in time if he chose to. So it's just a way for Marvel to put his character on the back burner until they decide to bring him back again. But then like T'Challa shows up with the blood of the Celestial on him, and there is a little bit of a fight there. But the big question that's really being asked is, are you going to leave this world? You need to get out of here. Now, the Lost One is really kind of operating with a bit of a vendetta, which is to say, like, I mean, I'm really half inclined to just wipe out your whole Earth, if for no other reason than the fact that you guys were just inconveniencing me, right? So I think I might do that. Now, this is where the Avengers arguably make a bluff. And what they say is that there are satellites that are orbiting the Earth right now that are powered with celestial energy, right? Celestial technology. And they're targeted directly at you. You do not have the ability to stop the full power of celestial energy. That's just not going to happen, right? Like, you were made by the Celestials. You can presumably be unmade by the Celestials, which really wouldn't make a whole lot of sense if their whole job was to stop the Celestials. But the fact remains, right? We're going to destroy you using these satellites. Initially, he doesn't believe them, but initially he dismisses it, right? Like, I detect no celestial infused satellites, and I do not believe that you would kill 8 million people, not even to save 8 billion. This is a bluff. And the response of Captain America is actually really genius here. It's like, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe the celestial technology hides their presence from you. Do you really want to take that risk? Are you going to gamble your life and your entire existence on the idea of proving us wrong, right? If that's really what you want to do, then sure, right? We can fire the satellite off that may or may not be there, and we can just see what happens, right? Like, we'll eradicate 8 million people on our world to save 8 billion people. You'll be dead. And at the end of the day, hey, you know, maybe it really is a small price to pay for the greater good. Now, knowing superheroes as we know them, that's not going to happen. And I would bet 9 times out of 10 that it really is a bluff. We never actually get an answer to this. Instead, the Lost One simply restores New York using his powers and sets everything back to rights. Following that, he basically ends up departing Earth as he agreed to do. And that's where the story ends. With that being said, guys, if you want to get caught up on the rest of Avengers Beyond, which was a lot better than this ending, to be honest, make sure you click this link to the playlist, and I will catch you all later. Peace.